The cabin lights flickered as the jet soared through a band of early morning clouds, but the real turbulence was unfolding between the seats. A man who controlled empires, who built towers of glass that touched city skies, now found himself standing in the narrow aisle of a first-class cabin that suddenly refused to acknowledge him. Passengers stared as the flight attendant gestured toward the back of the plane, her smile polished, her tone sharpened by an invisible blade. Moments later, whispers spread like wildfire. By the time the jet's wheels touched the ground, the airline would lose $3 billion. But no one knew it yet. If you want powerful stories like this, make sure you subscribe to Racism, Untold Stories, and never miss the truth hidden behind everyday injustice. Morning sunlight drifted across the skyline like liquid gold, washing the glass towers of Manhattan in a quiet glow. Far above the streets rose a penthouse that blended steel, stone, and serenity into a place where ambition lived beside reflection. This was the home of Darius Holt, a man whose life had been shaped by both brilliance and burden. He moved through the space with practiced calm, placing a single leather suitcase by the door. His day was supposed to be simple: a flight to California, a meeting with partners, a new project that promised global transformation. Nothing suggested that the journey itself would become the story that the world would never forget. Darius was the type of man whose presence carried weight without noise. His suits were tailored but never loud, his car sleek but not showy. He had learned early in life that invisibility was sometimes safety, and he had carried that truth with him even after he built a multi-billion-dollar empire. Some people saw him as a visionary, others saw him as a mystery, but he understood precisely what many saw first: his skin, his height, his quiet demeanor. Judgments walked ahead of him long before he stepped into any room. He made his way to the private elevator, adjusting the cuffs of his charcoal coat. The morning felt calm, but beneath that calm lived the kind of tension only black excellence understood. A tension built from years of entering spaces where he was both admired and underestimated, welcomed and doubted, praised and quietly diminished. Today felt no different. Still, he carried himself with the same dignity that had guided him through every obstacle that life had placed in his path. The streets below pulsed with energy. Yellow taxis weaved between delivery trucks. Commuters hurried along sidewalks dusted with remnants of last night's rain. Darius stepped into the waiting town car, settling into the back seat as the driver merged into traffic. The airport was a familiar destination, a place of movement and opportunity. Yet something in the air felt slightly off, like a song played a half note too flat. He brushed the feeling aside and focused on the day ahead. As the car approached the terminal, he noticed the subtle shift in how eyes followed him. Some glanced with curiosity, others with assumption. None of it surprised him. He moved toward the first-class check-in counter with the slow, confident pace of a man who had walked through a lifetime of silent scrutiny. Every step felt steady, every breath intentional. Years of discipline had turned his composure into armor. Inside the terminal, polished floors reflected the silhouettes of hurried travelers. Screens flickered with departure times. The scent of roasted coffee drifted through the air. Darius approached the first-class counter, presenting his passport and itinerary to the attendant. Her eyes scanned the documents, then him, then the documents again. A small pause floated in the space between them. He recognized that pause. It was a quiet questioning of belonging. The faintest hesitation that revealed a judgment she attempted to hide behind a professional smile. She handed him his boarding pass without warmth. He accepted it without reaction. Microaggressions slipped over him like rain on stone. He had weathered far worse. With his boarding pass in hand, he proceeded through security. The lines were long, but he moved through them with patience. Children cried, luggage wheels squeaked, and announcements echoed through the terminal. He felt ready for the peace that first class usually offered, a space where he could prepare for the weighty discussions ahead. His latest venture aimed to bring affordable, sustainable technology to underserved communities. It was a mission that meant everything to him. A mission driven by memories of neighborhoods where opportunity flickered like dim streetlights and hope felt borrowed rather than owned. He reached the gate with 20 minutes to spare. The first-class passengers lounged in plush seats behind a velvet rope, sipping beverages poured into glass cups instead of plastic ones. Darius sat near the window, watching the morning sky brighten. A group near him whispered loudly about stock prices, weekend retreats, and new mergers. None paid him much attention. He was used to this. Wealth itself did not erase racial assumptions. Sometimes it sharpened them. Soon the boarding announcement echoed across the seating area. Families gathered their belongings, business travelers closed their laptops, and the velvet rope parted to allow the first-class passengers forward. Darius rose with them, moving toward the front of the line. Yet when he reached the podium, the flight attendant gave him the kind of smile that felt rehearsed, not welcoming. Her eyes flicked up and down, taking in his suit, his luggage, his skin. Something cold passed through them, something quiet but unmistakable. She looked at his boarding pass as if it were a puzzle that refused to make sense. Then she glanced at the passengers behind him, offering them warmth she withheld from him. He felt the shift before it fully happened, the tiniest crack in the atmosphere. A question he did not ask, but whose answer he already knew. She scanned the pass again with unnecessary emphasis. Her posture stiffened. Her breath tightened. He could sense the narrative forming in her mind, a narrative shaped not by truth, but by assumption. The jet bridge hummed with movement. Laughter floated from the first-class cabin. Beneath it all, a quiet pulse of tension swelled in the space between him and the attendant. Something was coming. Something rooted in the same bias he had witnessed countless times. Something he had hoped he would not face today. But injustice rarely waits for permission. As she motioned him aside, as subtle as a blade wrapped in silk, he felt the beginning of an unraveling. A single moment was shifting the direction of the entire day. A seed of prejudice was settling into place, ready to grow into something far larger than she ever imagined, because she had no idea who he truly was. And she had absolutely no idea what this small moment of discrimination would cost the airline, or her, or the world watching. The flight attendant believed she held authority over a single seat, but she was about to change the trajectory of a global corporation, the fate of thousands of employees, and the future of the airline industry. All with one careless decision. All because of one careless assumption. And the world would not forgive it. The air inside the jet bridge felt colder than the terminal, as if the space itself sensed the tension that had begun to coil around Darius. Passengers moved past him with hurried footsteps, their rolling suitcases tapping against the floor in an uneven rhythm. He remained still, feeling the familiar weight settle in his chest. A weight formed from years of encountering the same quiet dismissal, the same veneer of politeness that masked something far more corrosive beneath it. The flight attendant stepped aside, pretending to check her tablet with exaggerated concentration. Her posture held the rigid confidence of someone who believed she was right, even before the facts had a chance to speak. When she finally looked up, her expression had shifted into a polished neutrality, the kind that attempted to disguise discomfort by performing authority. Darius knew this pattern. He had experienced it in boardrooms, restaurants, hotel lobbies, and even at charity events he funded. It was the rhythm of racism that wore the disguise of procedure. Passengers continued boarding, forming a line that forced him to move even closer to the wall, as if the space he occupied needed to shrink. A few cast quick glances at him, curiosity wrapped in judgment. He felt the familiar sting of assumption, an invisible bruise formed by the collision between identity and expectation. Yet he stayed still, not out of defeat, but out of discipline. His life had taught him that reacting in haste often fed the biases of the people who misjudged him. Moments later, another attendant joined the first. Their hushed exchange carried an energy that he recognized instantly. The slight narrowing of one woman's eyes, the tilt of the other's head. The unspoken agreement formed between people who believed they were handling a discrepancy rather than reinforcing a system. The decision hung in the air long before it was expressed through gestures and glances. They had convinced themselves that he did not belong in the first-class cabin, that something about him felt out of place, that something about him did not fit the image they expected. The line of passengers thinned as more individuals disappeared into the aircraft. Darius waited, breathing slowly, centering himself. Every detail around him sharpened, the hum of the engines, the soft thump of luggage against overhead bins, the distant chatter of travelers settling into their seats. His pulse remained steady, but his awareness expanded with every passing second. The attendant approached him again. Her polished smile had vanished, leaving behind a thin expression carved by quiet certainty. She gestured toward the handheld device in her grip, tapping a few buttons as if the machine itself had issued a verdict. She pointed toward the rear of the plane. The gesture was small, almost polite, yet it reverberated with an unmistakable message. Not here, not you, not in this space. He stood motionless for a moment. The jet bridge felt narrower, the air heavier. A few passengers noticed the exchange, pausing just long enough to form silent opinions. Their expressions reflected a mixture of confusion and quiet validation. In their eyes, the attendants were simply doing their jobs, and the man who had been singled out was simply experiencing procedural formality. But Darius understood better. He had lived long enough to distinguish error from prejudice, oversight from assumption, and inconvenience from discrimination. He stepped forward, moving toward the aircraft not because he accepted their judgment, but because he understood the importance of observing the unfolding injustice. The truth reveals itself most clearly when it is given enough space to grow. Inside the cabin, the glow of first-class lighting washed over the seats, illuminating wide leather cushions, glass partitions, and polished fixtures. Passengers in tailored suits and luxury clothing arranged their belongings unaware of the quiet storm forming only a few steps away. The attendant placed herself between him and the first-class section with practiced ease. Her action appeared casual, but the intent behind it was unmistakable. She ushered him toward economy, guiding him into a space where the seats squeezed together like compressed ribs. He walked with slow steps, each one deliberate, each one carrying the weight of the injustice taking shape. The cabin seemed unaware of his presence, or perhaps it chose not to notice. Row after row blurred into a tapestry of cramped seats, overhead bags, restless passengers, and recycled air. He finally stopped near the middle of the plane, lowering himself into a seat that was far smaller than the one he had paid for. The armrests pressed against his sides. The legroom was barely enough for his tall frame, his tailored coat folded awkwardly around him. The contrast between who he was and where he had been placed formed a painful metaphor, one that echoed through the narrow aisles and flickering lights. Around him, passengers adjusted their bags and chatted among themselves. Some noticed him and offered brief glances, but none lingered long enough to question why a man who clearly did not fit the space around him was sitting here. Assumptions filled the silence like invisible smoke. In many of their minds, his presence in economy felt more normal than his presence in first class. This was the quiet architecture of bias, built from years of societal conditioning. The engines outside began to roar as the plane prepared for departure. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. The attendants walked through the aisles, checking seatbelts and compartments. When they passed him, their eyes avoided his. There was no acknowledgement of the inconvenience they had created, no awareness of the offense, only a rigid professionalism that attempted to hide the discriminatory foundation of their decision. Darius sat still, his breath steady, his mind focused. He replayed the moments that had led him here, studying them with the precision of a strategist. He knew the airline's corporate structure. He knew their leadership struggles, their financial vulnerabilities, their recent controversies. He knew that their brand relied heavily on public perception. Most importantly, he knew that the executive meeting he was traveling to was not simply a negotiation. It was a final decision on whether his company would partner with this airline in a deal worth billions. A deal that would save them from looming collapse. A deal that would transform the future of global aviation. A deal that depended entirely on a single man. Him, the attendants, did not know this. The passengers did not know this. The airline did not know this. But the universe had a way of revealing the truth in the most unexpected moments. As the plane accelerated down the runway, Darius closed his eyes for a brief second. The injustice pressed against him like the tight confines of his seat. But it also ignited something inside him. Not anger, not bitterness, but clarity. A clarity sharpened by experience and strengthened by purpose. The airline had made a choice, and soon the consequences of that choice would begin to unfold. Not out of revenge, not out of spite, but out of justice. Justice that had waited patiently. Justice that had arrived at 30,000 feet. The aircraft leveled at cruising altitude, slicing through a sea of white clouds that billowed like mountains sculpted from mist. Inside the cabin, a false calm spread. Passengers scrolled through screens, drifted into naps, or gazed absent-mindedly at the sky. But beneath the soft hum of engines and the dim cabin lights, a silent turning point was already forming. It hovered over the plane like an unseen weight, waiting for its moment to strike. Darius remained seated in the narrow economy chair, shoulders tense against the confining frame. The injustice lingered in the air around him, sharp enough to cut through the recycled oxygen. He felt the small tremors of turbulence ripple through the cabin, but the real shaking came from something deeper. It came from the rising truth that the airline had unknowingly provoked. He had spent years mastering calm, building discipline, and walking through spaces that tested his worth. Now, that discipline guided him as he observed every detail, every gesture, every unspoken assumption that had led to this moment. Half an hour into the flight, movement stirred in the aisles. Passengers shifted in their seats, reacting to the sudden appearance of the lead flight attendant making her way through the cabin. Her posture radiated control, confidence, and a polished assurance that came from years of routine. Her eyes passed over passengers without pause, but when she reached Darius, something in her expression flickered. She had seen his name, she had seen his reservation, she had seen the mistake, and she had seen what that mistake meant. Earlier, she had reviewed the flight manifest, preparing her reports for landing. It was a simple task she had performed countless times. But today, the list presented her with a revelation that tightened her throat. Near the top of the manifest sat a name marked with a corporate insignia she recognized instantly. A name attached to the meeting the airline had been anticipating with desperation. A name that had appeared repeatedly in internal memos, executive briefings, and strategic updates. Darius Holt, the man whose signature held the power to restore their financial standing, the man whose approval could secure the multi-billion-dollar partnership that would rescue the airline from public decline. The man whose influence could elevate or devastate their future. She had downgraded him. She had dismissed him. She had reduced him to a seat that symbolized everything the airline insisted it did not stand for. The realization washed over her with a force that shook her composure. Now, as she stood a few inches from the man she had wronged, she felt the gravity of her actions settle upon her like a mountain of cold stone. The turbulence outside intensified briefly, rocking the cabin. Passengers murmured, adjusting their belongings. But Darius remained steady, his gaze fixed on the passing clouds, his breathing calm and controlled. He felt her presence, but he did not move. He did not offer acknowledgement. The weight of responsibility rested solely on her shoulders. She retreated, disappearing into the front cabin in a haze of panic masked by professional ritual. Her mind raced as she approached the cockpit where another attendant waited. While they communicated in hushed urgency, the truth was clear. The damage had already been done. Correction was impossible. Reversal was futile. The moment had already defined itself. The plane surged through a bank of dark clouds, rattling softly before settling again into smooth air. The shift in atmosphere mirrored the shift inside the airline staff. The attendants whispered among themselves, exchanging glances heavy with concern. The high-value client they had mishandled was not merely important. He was essential. He was the keystone of their future, the deciding force behind a partnership they could not afford to lose. Every minute of the flight became a countdown. Every second became a reminder. The airline had judged him. The airline had diminished him. The airline had placed a black CEO in the back of a plane he could have purchased outright, and the airline would pay for it. As the aircraft approached the California coastline, golden sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating the cabin with a warm glow. Passengers sat upright, preparing for landing. The attendants resumed their roles, but tension tightened their movements. They felt the weight of the impending fallout settle over them. The mistake they had made hovered like a storm cloud, ready to unleash its thunder. Through the descent, Darius remained composed. His stillness carried the quiet authority of a man who no longer needed to prove anything. He did not seek revenge. He did not crave apology. He understood that some lessons require silence to resonate. Silence forces truth to reveal itself. Silence is often more powerful than confrontation. The wheels touched the runway with a firm jolt. Engines roared in reverse thrust. The plane slowed, drifting toward its gate. Passengers stirred, collected bags, stretched limbs, stiffened by hours of confinement. But in the front cabin, dread settled deeper into the attendants' bones. The moment of reckoning was approaching. When the seatbelt light blinked off, passengers rose from their seats. Darius stood slowly, unfolding himself from the cramped space. His tall frame filled the aisle, his coat draped elegantly over one arm. His movements carried the calm precision of a man who knew exactly where he belonged, regardless of where he had been placed. As he stepped forward through the narrow aisle, the attendants braced themselves. The lead attendant waited at the front of the cabin, her expression strained, her eyes flickering with guilt and fear. But Darius passed without pause, without glance, without acknowledgement. He did not need to witness her remorse to understand its depth. He did not need to validate her regret to appreciate its inevitability. He walked through the jet bridge with a slow, measured pace. Each step carried purpose. Each breath carried truth. The sense of injustice that had filled him earlier had transformed into something sharper, something clearer, something decisive. Beyond the jet bridge, 2 black SUVs waited. His team stood assembled. They recognized instantly what had occurred: his misplaced seat, the tension in the air, the silence in his gaze. They understood everything without a single spoken word. Within minutes, he entered the boardroom of the waiting corporate tower. Executives from the airline sat stiffly around a long, polished table, unaware that the flight had already rewritten their fate. They greeted him with smiles crafted from hope and desperation. They believed the deal was theirs to finalize. But the injustice had already made the decision. The partnership would collapse. The approval would never come. $3 billion would vanish. Because respect cannot be requested after it has been denied. Because justice has a way of landing exactly where it must. And the airline had committed its gravest mistake at 30,000 feet. The sun hovered above the California horizon, casting long golden beams across the boardroom windows. The light shimmered on the polished conference table, turning its surface into a quiet mirror that reflected the faces of men and women who believed they were moments away from triumph. Their hands rested on documents prepared with precision. Their expressions carried a blend of anticipation and relief. They had pinned their future on this meeting. They had attached faith to a name they had not fully understood, and they had failed to realize that the weight of their own decisions had already sealed their fate long before Darius Holt stepped through the door. He entered with calm steps, his posture steady, his silence more eloquent than any speech he could offer. The room straightened as if pulled upright by an invisible force. The executives did not yet know they were witnessing the final moments of a relationship that had crumbled before it had begun. They did not know that the seeds of their collapse had been planted on a jet bridge thousands of miles away, watered by assumptions and grown through a single careless act of discrimination. Darius took his seat at the head of the table. His assistant placed the contract folder in front of him. He opened it with slow precision, scanning the pages that reflected months of negotiations, projections, and promises. The executives watched every movement, holding their breath in quiet hope. They believed the meeting was simply a formality. They believed the partnership had already been secured. They believed their future was aligned with his vision. But the flight had revealed something deeper. It had revealed a culture of disregard, disguised as routine. It had revealed systemic blindness wrapped in polite professionalism. It had revealed that even in an industry desperate for salvation, the instinct to diminish a black man remained stronger than the instinct to protect the company's own survival. Darius closed the folder. The weight of the gesture rippled across the room. He stood, offering no explanation, no justification, no anger. The executives paled, their breaths caught. Their hearts sank beneath the heavy realization that something irreversible had taken place. They sensed the decision before it was stated. They felt the loss before it became official. He walked out of the boardroom with the same calm authority he carried through the airport, through the plane, and through every space that attempted to reduce him. His silence did not mask weakness. It revealed power. True power. Power that did not need to shout to be heard. Power that did not need to argue to be felt. Power that could change the direction of corporations and the destinies of thousands without raising a single word. The door shut behind him with a quiet finality, a sound so soft yet devastating enough to echo through the entire corporate tower. Hours later, the news began to spread. Board members received calls filled with confusion. Investors asked questions that went unanswered. Analysts attempted to understand how a deal that had seemed guaranteed had unraveled in a matter of minutes. Meanwhile, social media whispered with rumors, speculations, and fragments of truth carried by employees who had sensed tension in the boardroom but lacked the full story. Darius returned to his hotel overlooking the ocean. Waves rolled against the shore, steady and endless. He watched them move with meditative stillness, absorbing the sound of water reaching land in rhythmic persistence. His thoughts drifted back to the cramped seat, the cold stares, the silent assumptions that had shaped his journey. He felt no triumph, only clarity. This was not victory. This was accountability. The airline executives met through the night, attempting to rebuild what had already collapsed. They blamed scheduling errors, they blamed systemic miscommunication, they blamed procedural misunderstandings, but beneath their excuses simmered an undeniable truth. Their downfall had not come from paperwork, it had come from prejudice. Their destruction had not been sparked by oversight. It had been ignited by bias. $3 billion evaporated in the hours that followed. Stocks dipped, investors retreated, partnerships dissolved, competitors took advantage. Employees whispered about the consequences of a single decision, a single moment, a single act of discrimination that had rewritten the company's fate. The flight attendants learned the truth as well. When they discovered who Darius Holt truly was, guilt swallowed their composure. Their earlier confidence crumbled under the weight of reflection. They replayed the moment repeatedly, the pause at the counter, the cold examination of his boarding pass, the subtle but sharp assumption that led to his removal from first class. They realized the depth of the harm they had caused. They realized that their actions had shaped a corporate catastrophe. They realized that prejudice, even when wrapped in politeness, carries consequences far greater than the individual it targets. But for Darius, the aftermath held something far more meaningful than financial impact. It held a quiet sense of transformation, not for himself. He had long understood his own strength. It held transformation for the world watching, for the people who believed that racism existed only in overt words or loud acts. This moment revealed the truth that discrimination is often quiet, subtle, invisible, and deeply embedded in routine. It showed that injustice thrives in the spaces people claim are harmless. It showed that power can be misused in the smallest gestures and the simplest assumptions. Days later, the story reached the public. Some expressed shock, others expressed anger. Many expressed recognition, understanding all too well how such moments unfold. For them, Darius represented more than a CEO. He represented every person who had been denied respect despite their achievements, their contributions, their humanity. He became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even the most successful individuals are not exempt from prejudice. In quiet moments, he reflected on the journey. He understood that the collapse of the partnership was not an act of revenge. It was a necessary correction, a recalibration, a reminder that disrespect cannot be ignored simply because it hides behind procedure. A reminder that progress is not built on silence. A reminder that dignity has a cost, and those who violate it will eventually pay. The world moved forward. The airline rebuilt slowly. Darius continued his work, launching new initiatives that prioritized equity, opportunity, and community. But the memory of that flight remained etched into history as a turning point. A moment that transformed not only a corporation, but the people who witnessed its downfall. The lesson lived on. Sometimes discrimination does not scream. Sometimes it whispers. But its impact is no less destructive. Sometimes the world learns its greatest lessons from the people it tries hardest to overlook. Sometimes the seat you deny someone becomes the mirror that reveals who you truly are. And sometimes the person you try to diminish becomes the one who determines your fate. If this story moved you, inspired you, or opened your eyes, make sure you subscribe to Racism Untold Stories for more powerful narratives that reveal hidden truths and challenge the world to do better.